Well, I want to welcome you all to a conversation on church multiplication. And really, the conversation is geared towards the art of parenting. What does it take, whether or not you're a young church, a couple years old, to maybe a church that's over 100 years old, but you've decided, I think it's time for us to multiply. Maybe you've never multiplied before. Maybe you have, and you kind of go, hey, it's been a little while. I want to revisit the conversation. And when we talk about multiplication, there's two layers. We're talking about multiplying leaders and sending them out. But really, the big picture is, what does it take for us to multiply the local church through church planting? And there's a science to the conversation. There's also an art to the conversation. We're going to kind of go back and forth between both of those things. And so I want to begin the conversation just again, welcome you to this very, very important conversation to kind of give us a little background why this is important. It was back in about 2016. Converge actually took part of a research study on what is happening when it comes to church planting and the need for church planting in our current country and with current population trends. And we found that we had actually kind of turned the tide, that we were closing down about 3,500 evangelical churches a year. But on the flip side, we are actually now planting close to 3,700 to 4,000 churches a year. Let's say we had about a net gain of about 300 churches a year. That's fantastic. But when you begin to look at the population trends, we have currently about one church per 1,000 people. If we just want to maintain the status quo of one church per 1,000 people in 2050, what would we have to do from 2020 to 2050 in order just to maintain the status quo? And the reality is we need a net gain, not of 300 churches a year, but we need a net gain of 1,900 churches a year just to maintain the status quo of what our population demands in order for people to truly have an opportunity to hear and respond to the gospel. That's where our part comes in, is what do we need to do in order to play our part in actually helping other people that are far from Christ come to know the saving knowledge of who he is and what he wants to do. Now, pre-pandemic 2019, the trend actually turned not necessarily in our favor. In 2019, we only opened 3,000 churches, but we actually closed about 4,500 churches around the U.S. And again, that's pre-pandemic. We're still, when the time that this is being recorded, we're still waiting on exact stats of what happened in 2020, 2021 to give us a picture. But the early estimates is that maybe we saw upwards of 8,000 to 9,000 churches close during the season of the pandemic. And so that should wake us all up and realize that this is an important conversation. And it's an important task for the church and the people of the church to rise up and go, hey, we're going to play our part in actually changing the status quo. And let's aim higher than status quo. Let's go beyond that. And so step one to building a multiplying church is, and this is so critical, everything else hinges on this, is you got to create vision alignment. Now, vision alignment, I would say, flows in three different levels. The first level is what I would say is you need to find vision alignment among the key leadership, the executive level leadership, whether or not that would include your elders, executive staff. But this needs to be an ongoing conversation of kind of what is it going to take, why is this necessary, and how are we going to move this forward. The second layer would be other just kind of key leaders. That may be key lay leaders, it may be staff leaders, but now you begin to kind of share the overall arcing vision. Hey, this is where we feel like God is calling us to do or what he wants us to be. And we got to begin to think through this a little differently about what is it going to take for us to actually multiply the church and to become a church planting church, to use that language. Then eventually you roll it out to the congregation. Now, when you think about creating vision alignment, there are a couple things that you need to ask yourselves in this conversation. Number one, what are we actually willing to sacrifice in order to launch a new congregation? It is going to require sacrifice. And I would say there's three major kind of costs that you're going to need to sit down and you want to define. Financially, time, and personnel. So financially, what are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to put forth in order to see a new church actually take off and flourish? How much time is this going to demand of our staff, our leaders, our bookkeeper, the senior staff? You want to kind of begin to play that out. How much time can we actually allot to make this happen? And then what about personnel? What personnel are we willing to send out the door? Maybe it's a student ministry pastor. Maybe it's small groups pastor. Maybe it's a whole team that you're looking at actually send out the door to actually see this new church get up and going. But these are important conversations in order to be able to begin to highlight what is it going to take, and it will, in the end, it's going to help you create vision alignment, and that will allow you to gain momentum, move forward. The second step towards kind of building a multiplying church is you really want to build a focused evangelistic culture. In other words, are we reaching our neighbors? Are we reaching our community for Christ? Would our community even know that we were gone if all of a sudden tomorrow we shut our doors? These are important conversations to begin to have and begin to think about, and then begin to think through, like, what is it going to take for us to turn the dial, to turn the thermostat up a little bit so that evangelistically we're a evangelistically driven church, that we have a desire to reach, and we're operating with a level of courage to actually see our neighbors, our coworkers, our family members be introduced to the gospel with an opportunity to respond to that. Now, this fuels ultimately it fuels the desire and the call to be a planting church. If this isn't a part of the plan and really the reason behind multiplying, I'm going to tell you right now, don't do it. If it's not evangelically driven with the hope and desire to see more people come to know who Jesus is, don't do it. It's way too hard. And that needs to be part of the factor in driving, because that will allow you to do and be creative and innovate in new ways in order to reach new people as well. So you want to build that evangelistically bringing type of culture of wanting to see people come into relationship with Jesus. The third step, you need to choose the right model. And there are a lot of different models out there. And so let me kind of walk you through some of the different models. Again, this is not an exhaustive list when it comes to the models of churches and church planting that exist, but it does highlight some of the key ones. And I want to just kind of walk you through kind of the strengths and things to think of, and even some of the challenges that might arise if this is. So the first kind of model is what I would dub a pioneering model. A pioneering model it consists of a small team of leaders that are kind of sent out from the parent church to reach an entire different focus group. It may be a completely different community that operates in a completely different way. It may be even across state lines. It could be across the country, where it's like, man, we just feel like, hey, I'm right here in Orlando, Florida, but we feel like, man, God is asking us to reach this community in Louisiana. And so we're going to actually send out the door a small group of people, key leaders, and we're going to do everything. And it's a pioneering. So it's going to require a level of entrepreneurialism by that team, those leaders that are going out in order to actually see this happen well. But again, it's driven by the fact that I think this group of people has the best opportunity to reach this group of people, and so it's time to send them out the door. The second model would be what we would kind of call branching. And this could be maybe hiving would be another phrase that maybe you're familiar with. It's when a significant core group of people is kind of released from the parent church. And thinking through, like, we're going to probably land somewhere about 30 to 40 minutes from the parent church. In some cases, depending on if it's in a city center, it may be actually closer from a mileage standpoint, but the drive time may be broken up because of multiple freeways or something of that sort. And so it was recognizing, hey, this community needs this group of people, and so we're going to send an entire group of people. And sometimes that group of people may be 30 people, maybe 50 people, be upwards of 100 people as well that are sent from the parent church in order to establish this new work. The third is what I would call colonizing. And colonizing is when you actually have several families who travel from a nearby community, that you actually kind of task them. You mobilize them to start a church where they actually live. And when it comes to how you assign the planter should work to fit in the context of that new community rather than just replicating what worked at the parent church, because the people groups, the way they operate, even ethnicities may be completely different in that new community than the community that the parent church exists. And so it's important to do a little bit of demographic work in that process as well to help you understand what is it going to take to actually reach these people and to be able to love them in a way that they receive that love. And so that would be kind of a colonizing model. Recognize, hey, we've got this group of people, maybe they're traveling from an hour away. to come and attend your church, what would it look like for us to actually start a ministry, to start a church in that community that in some ways replicates what we're currently doing at the parent church, but contextualizing it to reach that community? Next would what we would call partnering. And partnering when it comes to church multiplication is really bringing several churches together who recognize maybe I can't do this all on my own, but if we pool our resources, we have the opportunity to start a church. And so it's kind of looking at the strengths of each church and recognizing what resources do we have available in order for us to be able to launch this new church. And this is really helpful when you're talking about finances and personal resources are kind of limited, maybe based on proximity or the location or even the size of the church. And so this allows for opportunity to be not only strategic, but innovative when it comes to how do we get more churches involved in the process of being able to work together to plant churches. And I think you look at even resources beyond just the financial and personnel resources. You look at coaching and other pieces that can come to play here. Another way of kind of multiplying the church is what I dub an unplanned pregnancy. And this happens when two churches survive. Not only do they survive, but they thrive out of a church split. So maybe it had a really hard, rough start at the beginning, but down the road, it realized, hey, God was in this and God used this. I don't recommend this as the default method of planting churches, but it does happen. And God uses that to multiply the church within different communities and sometimes even within the same community. And so I just want to at least bring that up because it does happen in our world. The last would be death with dignity. And death with dignity, this occurs when the population, maybe it changes, a demographic changes. And as a result, the existing church has to close down its ministry. And in that process, they decide, you know what, we're not going to just sell this off to the highest bidder, but we want to reinvest the assets that we've accumulated over maybe decades into another church and help them actually get up and going. And I love this. I think this is a beautiful picture of the kingdom of God when they recognize, you know what, our season is done. It's come to a close, but let's bless the next generation of church. And what an opportunity to leave a phenomenal legacy in place. And so that's what I would call kind of death with dignity. And so that gives us kind of a framework of some different ways of multiplying the church. And then the last is another one. It's the multi-siting approach. And in a multi-site, it's a little different than a standard church plant because the goal of multi-site is really to replicate the culture and the systems of the parent church, but to do so in multiple locations. And so as a result, a lot of times it takes more resources than what you would typically see getting a new church up and off the ground. Now, the fourth kind of key step in building a multiplying church is you got to identify potential communities. So how do we do that? First of all, there's a great resource, strategic partner to Converge out there called GLOO, Gloo. And they really have some of the most robust demographic work and studies available to you to be able to kind of really dive deep into understanding specific zip codes. You can draw out a specific map and it'll give you everything plus more than probably you even want to see. But it's important to do a demographic study on the surrounding areas. What are the tendencies of this group of people versus this group of people? What motivates them to do what they do? What motivates this zip code to do what they do? Look for similarities, but also identify the differences. Then once you kind of get a basic understanding of kind of the population, the growth trends, what's going on in those locations, take some time, do some on-site reconnaissance. Drive the community. Find a local coffee shop, sit and watch and just observe who the people are, how they tend to act and respond. Maybe drive around even on a Sunday morning and just take some information of what churches seem to be thriving, what churches may have a very empty parking lot. Maybe there are certain churches that have actually closed down their doors and the building's just sitting vacant. So take some time, do some reconnaissance in that community that maybe God is leading you to plant a church. Then spend time discerning the local spiritual climate. And I would highly encourage you to take some time, get to know the local pastors, invite them out to coffee, invite them out to grab lunch. Just listen to their stories. They've been there before maybe you've ever thought about planting a church in that area. And so take some time and just gain the information, have an understanding for how the community seems to operate, what what the spiritual receptivity is to the gospel in those communities, and what maybe are the biggest challenges of that community, and how can we partner together to reach more people for Jesus in that process. And so take some time, pray, discern the local spiritual climate of that community. Then you want to brainstorm. What kind of church is actually needed here? And where do they best fit in the community? What direction do people drive? What do they not drive? And begin to prioritize the location and the type of church that would best fit that community. And then in doing so, begin to think through the need and opportunity. Where the greatest need, that's where you have a phenomenal mission to be able to focus in on and to reach that community. And so identify the very specific, maybe the top 3 needs of that community. And then begin to think through, well, who best fits that? I can think of one community we were thinking years ago of actually launching a new church plant in. And I was very adamant, like the person that goes to plant in that community has got to speak NASCAR. And that probably gives you a level of image, to the community that we were looking at planting in. But that was a real thing that you got to begin to think through who actually fits that community, who can dive deep and begin to have meaningful conversations, who's going to be accepted by that. And some of the more challenging areas, the more urban it is, the more rural it is, that is even that much more of an important conversation and question to begin to ask yourself. Fifth step to building a multiplying church: prepare to handle pushback and concerns that are going to rise up. What are some of the questions? What are some of the concerns that you're going to hear? You're going to hear people from other communities, your church, other churches ask these type of questions. So I want to encourage you, you just need to be ready to respond. The first question is this: do we really need more churches? Yes. I shared at the beginning of our conversation just some interesting statistics of what's going on based on population trends in the United States over the next 30 years. And currently, what are we actually doing when it comes to multiplying the local church? And so 100%, we absolutely do. But that's going to be a real felt need for some of those churches and some of those maybe other leaders in that community. For instance, we're getting ready to actually multiply a church out of our local church in a community about 35 minutes south of where we're at. And we did our due diligence, reached out to all the churches and pastors, invited them to coffee, wanted to just sit down, hear what God is doing. And even before some of them accepted it, they just began to push back on us. We don't need more churches. Why don't you just save your resources? You don't need to come here. You're just going to end up taking our people. But the reality is, what they didn't realize is that community had doubled in size in the last 4 years. And though the community itself had doubled in size, they had not added one single church to that community. And so the community went from roughly 28,000 people to 60,000 people in a 4-year period, but saw no increase in the local church. The reality is, they not only do they need more churches, they need a lot more churches in that community. And so relationally, just reach out, maybe recognize sometimes it may come across a certain way, but it may be just speaking from ignorance. And so take a moment and train the ignorance. Don't assume obstinance right off the bat. Second question you're going to wrestle through is, well, isn't this effort going to drain valuable resources? In other words, we're going to have to spend a lot of money in order to be able to see a new church up and going. Yeah, it's going to require a sacrifice. There's no doubt about it. But when you think about it, I think it honors the Lord, because we are investing in His kingdom and His mission and His glory. And I think the Lord honors that. And the reality is, we see over and over and over again churches that sacrifice and use their resources in order to multiply the local church. God takes care of them in oftentimes miraculous ways through that process. The third question you're going to is, what can a new church do that we can't? And the reality is, a new church tends to meet new people in new ways that existing churches don't. And the research actually backs up the fact that new churches are more evangelically driven. In other words, they're evangelizing their community more than existing churches, because they're not necessarily haven't been bombarded by, well, the building needs this or this person needs this. And it's all new. And a new church tends to not exist if they're not seeing new people come to Jesus in that process as well, because if they don't have any people. Now, when it comes to the multiplying process, there is what I would kind of dub a healthy life cycle to planting. So I want to kind of walk through real quick these life cycle stages. The first is reproduction stage. You have to come to this moment where you realize, hey, we're going to do this. We are going to multiply. We want to. We're going to pray through. Maybe we look at 3 different locations that we're looking at doing. We're going to begin to do our due diligence. We're going to research the demographics. But we are going to do this, and maybe even put a date on the calendar saying our hope, our prayer is that maybe 2 years from now, maybe it's 18 months from now, that we'll actually have launched a new church in that location. That's stage 1, reproduction stage. The second stage is conception stage. And I would honestly say use language that represents childbearing, pregnancy with your church and with people, because people will understand it, makes sense, it's clear to them. And so you hit the conception stage where this is kind of, you go, guys, we are pregnant. We're moving forward in this process. And so now's the time you begin to pray and you create a prayer strategy. Maybe you take groups of people and you actually do prayer walks in the community that you're actually kind of say, this is where we're going to launch a church. Now it's time to recruit. You recruit staff, you recruit team members, you recruit leaders, maybe you recruit the planter if the planter's not somebody on your staff that you've raised up to send out. In that process, you want to assess, train, mobilize. So you want to assess people's skill set, assess their calling, because the reality is some people may feel called because they're not getting their way in the current parent church. Those aren't the people you want to send into a new church, because you really want somebody that's going to uphold the DNA and help build the culture that is a healthy culture in that new church. You don't want to send a bunch of unhealthy people into this new church location. So lead pastors, sorry if you have that person on your list that you're going, man, I really would love to see this person gone. Don't send them to the new church that you're trying to plant. But you want to assess the team. You want to assess the leaders. You need to train them. And this is at every level. And you need to, number one, train them not to just look at the lead pastor for all of their answers, but to begin to operate as leaders within that and recruiting and multiplying themselves so that the team itself begins to be stronger and multiply. So train them how to do that. How do you do guest services and do it well? How do you set up the visual arts equipment, making sure that the sound equipment is done and handled? It's all those little details you're going to have to think through. What if you're in a portable situation? You want to train your team how to set up and tear down in efficient ways. And then it's mobilized. It's kind of like, all right, figure it out. Go. We've done everything we can. We've recruited, we've assessed, we've trained. Now go make the mission actually take place. And that's where we hit stage 3. This is the prenatal stage. This is when essential ministry systems are actually being developed before the church is actually ready to go public. So you're thinking through and you're setting up, okay, bookkeeping. How are we going to process money that's coming in? How are we going to set up maybe the first quarterly budget? I oftentimes encourage church planners, don't think yearly budget, because it's just too big. Think quarterly, and then once you get to second quarter, set your second quarter budget based on what your first quarter budget actually was. But this is the phase that you want to get all the pieces in place. You want to have your team set in place, who's going to be where, who's going to stand at the front doors, who's going to be in the parking lot, who's going to do child check-in. All those things need to be decided and in place and ready to go before you actually go public with your actual first public worship service. And then it's birth. And then you kind of hit this growth phase. So you have the grand opening, we made it, we're now a church, and now you kind of enter in that growth phase. And that's not just people growth, but it's discipleship growth. How are we actually discipling people and seeing them grow in their own personal walk with Jesus? And some common insights that I want to kind of walk you through when it comes to parenting that I think sometimes parent churches may get wrong during the process of multiplying the church. First of all, the parents' church, their role should actually decrease over time, meaning they need to have a level of autonomy as a new church to be able to figure things out. You don't want to problem solve all their problems. You want to give them the freedom and the opportunity to see God actually show up in their life and in their story just as much as God has shown up in your church as the parent church organization over the years. And so don't rob them of that. And the only way to be able to actually give them that freedom is your role and what you do and what you say and how you support the ministry needs to decrease over time for it to be healthy. The second is Get all the agreements and common understandings in writing way ahead of time. So what is the time frame? If we're sitting there and you're looking at a staff guy going, hey, you're going to be our planter, and he's like, I want to be the planter, write it out. What's the transition process going to look like? Write out any agreement when it comes to, hey, financially, we're going to support you at this level. Maybe it's for the first year, we're going to do X amount, and then we're going to back it to 50% year 2. Then we're going to go to 25% of that support by year 3. And then by year 4, you're on your own. Those are the type of agreements I'm talking about. If there's an agreement, hey, we're going to handle your bookkeeping for the first year, no charge. Like, just write it out and get a level of agreement ahead of time. So that way we're not inserting our own ideas when things were actually agreed upon. And that will just help any type of tension that could be created between the parent church and the new church plant as that process rolls out. Third is church planters need good coaching. They need a coach that's going to walk with them, say the hard thing when the hard thing needs to be said. My recommendation to actually have that person who is coaching the new church plant be from outside the parent church. That way they have a different perspective of both the role the parent church plays, but also what God is doing in that church plant. And so they can give objective answers, objective truth through that process versus going, well, I know this is just the way we've done it, and so you need to do it the way we did it, which can sometimes creep in if the coach is just from the parent church. Fourth is planters. You need to know for an existing church perspective and existing church leaders, planters rarely actually leave well, meaning the thing that makes them a really good church planter is what causes them not to leave the existing church well. And so the more that you can get ahead of that curve, that's why it's important. Like, if you can get the agreements in writing, it will help that process. But I just want to kind of reassure you in this process that it's a gift if it goes real smooth and that planter leaves really well. But it is rare for it to actually go that way. And so just know that that's kind of common, and that's kind of the process. Next step, kind of insight for parent churches: don't move forward until there's strong leadership buy-in in the vision. You want, again, a lot of agreement in the process going, hey, we're in this. We're going to sacrifice. We know it's going to require sacrifice, but we want to do everything we possibly can to see the church multiplied. Don't move forward until you have strong leadership buy-in. Number 6, be willing to release control of the new church. You really have to. It's kind of like that parenting relationship with my own kids, that as they grow, I move into different roles. I move from even coaching to consulting as they age. And that's where you want to be as a parent church. You want to move through the hey, we're birth, I'm protecting you, we're doing everything we possibly can, to, hey, I'm kind of in a coaching role, to eventually you want to be a consultant role where you just celebrate what God is doing and how he's working in the life of that church. Lastly, don't bypass the importance of kind of assessment, training, and coaching. Sometimes we sit there, well, I know this guy, I think he can do it, and we just kind of push them through too quickly. That's one of the things. I'm a big believer and believe that here at Converge, we have one of the best assessment centers in the entire world when it comes to assessing future church planters. Don't bypass the process of assessing and going through a formal assessment process, necessary training, and actually having good coaching by the side. And coaching is something I would encourage you, like, be willing to pay for. Even as a parent church, maybe that's the part of the role that you go, hey, we're not able to invest a ton into startup costs, but what we will do is we will hire a coach to walk with you up to the launch and even 1 year post-launch to help you gain as much momentum as you possibly can. And once you do it, rest. It's okay as a parent church, rest, recover. But here's the thing. Let me encourage you, do it again. We need, even if you've tried to multiply and it didn't go the way that you thought it should go, and people were kind of burned and relationships were hurt, don't give up on it. Do it again. The kingdom needs you to think through what is it going to take in order to multiply, and a willingness to be able to step up. The harvest is dependent on it. Would you be one of those workers that answers the call? I'm praying for you. Hope you will.